he has to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Zingiza, for that introduction. And also thank you to Dipper for the opportunity to speak on your project or about an idea that is implied in your project. As Zingiza said, the title of my conversation, that's what I call it, because I do not believe that I have any specific truth to spread, but I will share my ideas on the implied question in the project, and then we'll have a conversation to see how my ideas will factor into the project. So the title is from MSSR, Frantz Fanon to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Language as a Technology of Self. Now, I'm gonna pause for a second, and that simply means I'm trying to share my screen to share a PowerPoint, which I believe will be quite helpful for you to see some of the ideas I'm raising. So I'll be a little silent now. Do you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay, very good. So that's the focus of my work. But before I do that, I want to start with a response to Professor Ugwanye's discussion in what I believe was the first webinar in the project. He focused on discussing aspects of African culture or African philosophy that will be instrumental in decolonization of peace in Africa. And during that particular session, as some of us will recall, there were so many questions. And one question that stuck with me was raised by another scholar who has a project in Africa. And the question pertains to how African culture and philosophy is really taking care of the subjugation of women in Africa, which imply that African culture lent itself to subjugation of women. Now, Professor Ugwanye responded to the question, but I think we'll need to detail his response a little further to show that African culture in itself is not designed to subjugate women. So what I have on the screen are two scholars who have devoted their work on showing that African culture reveals a system of balance between man and woman, that what we see in African culture as subjugation of women is rather individual disposition towards reality. And those individual dispositions are really imbricated on the transfer of sensibility, which we can trace to colonialism. So Ifi, Amadume, and Mwanda Achebe are two giant scholars on this issue, and they have said in so many of their work, which I listed on the screen, that we should go back to pre-colonial history of Africa to discover what actually is the status of women in African culture. And if you really dig into that history, you will see that they have a preeminent position. In Igbo cosmology, for example, the greatest god in that cosmology is a woman. Now, the gods in Igbo cosmology are tended by women, while the goddesses are tended by men. So if you look at the matrix of that relationship, you will see that there is balance in the culture itself, that no one, in other words, the woman is not left behind, nor is the man left behind. So I want to bring that up to show that what Professor Guanyi was saying is quite in order in terms of Igbo cosmology, but I want us to really look into the sources I put up here to get deeper understanding on how colonialism really destroyed the prehistoric sensibility when it comes to representation of women in Africa. So what we see in the current dispensation of our reality with regard to women representation in Africa is nothing but idiosyncratic. It's not essentially founded on African culture. And having said that, I'm going to move on to my own talk, but I want to make sense of my purpose so that you can use that to follow along and, of course, use that to hold me responsible, assuming that I do not say what I plan to say. So my goal is to trace the project of decolonialism as an encounter with colonial discourse, because today we hear decolonialism as though it's something new. It is not. It's been around for quite some time. Maybe it has not been as successful as it was designed. And I want to also explain that any effective decolonizing agenda should include reclamation of the indigenous languages in Africa. And I hope to achieve that by looking at three scholars that I personally call the giants in the process of decolonization, and they are César, Fanon, and Thiong'o. So the new insight I will bring in this conversation is the necessity of reclaiming not the indigenous languages in Africa. But I want to also make sense of my title, because those of us who are familiar with Foucault will automatically say that this is akin to Foucault's technologies of the self. And if you thought that, you're correct. So it is important to explain that for us to understand the extent of my argument. Foucault's work could be classified under 4 technologies: technology of production, which is really processes of creating something, and technology of sign, of course, the process of making meaning, and technology of power, which seems to overshadow his work because of his theory of punishment and his theory of docility. And finally, technologies of the self, which was his lecture that became a very short book. But none of these technologies could actually be distinguished from the other. But I'm focusing on the technology of the self, which he defines as a way of being, in addition to other characteristics he attached to it. So technology of self, in simple parlance, is nothing but how oneself manages his or her existence within a given environment or culture or tradition or belief. So when we think of self, therefore, Foucault was able to say that the self simply means sameness. In other words, if you're referring to yourself, you're invariably referring to your identity. But the relationship between oneself and one's identity, of course, is performative. So there's a need for one to foster truth about oneself through negotiation, that is through engagement of that self with other selves in a given environment. So with this background, it's necessary to raise a few questions that will guide us. And that is, how does the self, that is the individual substance of rational nature, represent himself or herself, the truth of his own thought, his beliefs, his custom and culture? And how is this truth constructed in relation to the technologies of domination and control available in governmental systems, institutions, and ideology? And you can see any response to the second question will be somewhat in opposition to the response to the first question, because the first question is an individual question, and the second question, of course, will probably come through political, social, and economic system, and will presuppose some kind of distortion of an individual's construction of his own truth based on his culture and understanding. I'm going to go through my talk one by one based on the authors that I've identified. Cesar. Anyone who has studied colonialism or colonial discourse or engaged in post-colonial studies will of course know Cesar. So I'm not here to repeat the avalanche of studies already done on Cesar, but rather to show that there's something in Cesar with regard to decolonization, which we have not really tapped into enough for it to become a system. So what I've done is to identify Cesar's works across time, and I was trying to put them in chronological order. Now, if you look, Cesar's work that introduced negritude is, or was, his notebook, which was published 1939. Now, if you go through all these publications, you will see some kind of consistency and some kind of growth in the development of his ideas on colonialism and, of course, decolonization. But my argument is that there is a genealogy in the development of his idea, which graduated in 1969 in his revision of Shakespeare's The Tempest. And it is in that play, I argue, that Cesar brought together his system of decolonization. So what I'm going to do henceforth on Cesar is to show how that is true. And of course, as I said, we are having a conversation, so we can talk more about that. Cesar defined colonialism in what I call, there's a particular term he used, which is not really an English word, but people use that. Immanuel Kant used so many neologisms, which has now become common terms in English. Cesar says that colonialism is identical or synonymous with thingification. So a thing, so in other words, he was turning thing into a verb, thingification. But he believed that the process of decolonization would destroy that processes of thingification. In other words, turning something into a thing, but will become therefore a means of creating universal humanism, which simply means a means of destroying that processes of thingification, processes of objectification, and processes of domination and reduction of human beings. So if we go into the play, which is translated as A Tempest, and linguistically, the movement of the article from Shakespeare's The Tempest to A Tempest in itself is a radical ontological revision. But I want to focus on the play. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, most of us who have studied post-colonialism and studied colonial discourse knows the argument that is presented with regard to the representation of Caliban, both in Shakespeare and now in César's play. So we understand the revolution, we understand the revision, we understand the agency César gave Caliban in A Tempest. We understand that he speaks. We understand that he has authority. So I'm not here to repeat that. What I'm trying to show you is the introduction of different languages in the play is intentional on the part of César as a means of decolonization, because he could have written that play without introducing those languages, and the writing back quality of the play would still have been there. But he introduced a different language, in this particular case, Kiswahili. So I'm going to pause for a moment just to share a section of the play. I hope it comes up. Okay. Okay, we are in the scene where let me see here. We're in the scene where Caliban entered the play for the first time. But before he enters, Prospero was actually looking for him. So when he enters, he says, Uhuru. Now, the way it is written here, if I had the liberty of stage direction, it tells me that he says that particular statement with excitement because of the exclamation point, Uhuru. And Prospero responds, what did you say? His response immediately suggests that he does not understand. He does not understand. And then he repeated it, Uhuru. And Prospero, of course, begins to undermine that language by saying that he's mumbling his native language. Now, this is just one translation. Now, I'm going to quickly stop and move back to my slide, if you don't mind, please. So this is the French version of that translated passage. So when he came, he spoke in excitement and said, Uhuru. Prospero didn't understand, and he repeats. And then Prospero responds. Now, the translation I showed you said that Prospero was saying, you're mumbling your native language. Now, this is the highlighted section of this short passage is the French version, which of course is the original version. So the translation of that is not really mumbling. So Prospero is telling him, you are returning back to your savage language again. And that means that this is not the first time he spoke that language. And of course, we can assume with confidence that he's been speaking that language all this time, and Prospero has also been hearing that same language. So we can therefore say with confidence that Caliban in Chaucer's play is cultivating himself based on his understanding of who he is now in this play, contrary to how he is objectified in Shakespeare's version. So his authority in Chaucer's version is founded on his understanding of himself, which is reflected in his comfortability in his own language, which he uses to navigate his experience in the play and uses it to encounter Prospero, who, of course, doesn't have the facility in that same language. Now, of course, we know the dialogue between them. Caliban has a better space. He's empowered. He can engage him. But that's what we know. What I'm focusing on is that that authority is really founded on his own language, which is Kiswahili. Now we have to know that this is literature. So Chaucer is trying to therefore connect the reader to the existence of this language. Now, if we are to unpack the context of Uhuru in the history of Africa, we will see that Chaucer is implying that Caliban has become a revolutionary, and he's becoming a revolutionary through his own language that he's using to engage the colonizer. By doing that, therefore, he's escaping the English ontological empire because he's now on a different space, trying to negotiate his reality with Prospero. But there is something I want to emphasize. Prospero in the play, even towards the end, is still in the island. No matter how weakened he is towards the end. Caliban, of course, with a different disposition, is still in that same island with Prospero. So that is a symbolic coexistence, no matter how diminished Prospero's presence and power is. But Chaucer is using this introduction of this language to tell us that Caliban's space is now reversed, that he has agency, that he can negotiate his reality, and he can also define himself. Because, of course, I'm assuming you know the play, he defined himself by changing his name, which is a metaphorical revolution when you change a name given to you by, quote unquote, your master. That means you have developed freedom and you have really possessed the ability to name things, and which means the ability to identify reality as a form of your truth. Now, this is not the only part of the play where Chaucer is introducing African sensibility. Eshu is a character in the play. Caliban, in so many sections of the play, sings, or I call it really worship, but stage direction says that he's singing, but he calls on Thiong'o. Thiong'o is a Yoruba god, just like Eshu. Now, I'm going to share in the chat, let me see here. I'm going to share in the chat a link of Wole Soyinka discussing Eshu in the context of Yoruba theology, for you to understand exactly what Cesar is trying to do, or is actually doing, by introducing this language and then introducing African culture, which Caliban understands. So I'm going to pause roughly for 2 to 3 minutes for you to get some insight on the concept of Eshu. If you don't mind, you can play that video on your own. So I'm going to pause for 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, I'm going to proceed. You of course you can still watch it later to deepen your insight on Eshu, who's a god in Yoruba pantheon. Now the question is, why does Cesar introduce that? Of course, it's not in Shakespeare's version. So Cesar uses all the characters in Shakespeare's version, but introduces this god. And the god actually spoke in the play. Now, given the characteristics of the god, I argue, let me put it that way, that it is intentional on Cesar's part to introduce Eshu instead of Thiong'o, or instead of Olodumare, or instead of any other gods in Yoruba pantheon, because Eshu is really the messenger of God, Olodumare, God in the Christian sense. She is the messenger. So he negotiates between all the other spirits, Orisha, all the other spirits, for God, Olodumare. And he or she has the power of really changing things, changing a person's nature or changing a person's condition. And he believes that, or she believes, because if you look at the carving of a shoe, you can't tell if it's a man or a woman. So he or she has the power of bringing things about and has also the power of mediating between two opposing realities. So it's my position that Cesare is aware of these characteristics of a shoe in Yoruba theology. So introducing it in the play, not only signifying on African sensibility, but rather showing that this particular sensibility would really function quite effectively as a paradigm for decolonization. In other words, using this principle of mediation between opposing realities would function quite effectively. So we have the African sensibility, we have the African language, Kiswahili to be specific, but it's actually a representation. So he could have used Yoruba as well. So Cesare is really emphasizing that decolonization cannot just occur by critiquing the colonial, by critiquing the colonial empire, by rejecting the colonial empire. It will start with that, but it will continue therefore with recognition of these sensibilities and using these sensibilities as a means of changing the status quo. Now, there is an observation I want to share. Cesare himself affirmed that his French is not Parisian, even though he had an impeccable French. So his French is rather an ontology, if you want, you can say it's a hybridized form of French in the sense that it introduces African sensibility at the same time maintaining the Parisian sensibility. So we have there two worlds together, which signifies on the functions of a shoe, the God, that has the power to mediate two opposing realities, and also has the power to become a messenger between the spirit and the gods. So we can see that the presence of a shoe aligns with the introduction of this other language that goes along with French. So if you're looking visually at the play or on the page that I shared, you will see Uhuru, which is Kiswahili, and then you will also see French. So the composition of these two languages is rather very significant in understanding Cesare's intention. So you cannot destroy one and leave the other, nor can you make sense of one without making sense of the other. So a shoes is there to bring this together, which imply that we as agents of decolonization will have to really look at these divergent realities and work on how to bring them together without just focusing on critique or reproofs. Now, there is an observation I want to share from Helen Gabord and Joan Thompson, which is really quite conducive to the position I have. And they said it very simply that Caliban does the job of interrogating and dismantling colonial power. And they also emphasize that the destruction of colonized language is a starting point of any decolonizing project. And that is exactly what Cesare is doing. But what Gilbert and Thompson didn't say is that Cesare also recognizes the integrity of French. So in as much as he's introducing this on the language. He's not destroying French, rather recreates French. So if I can borrow the loose concept here, the concept of deterritorialization, I will say therefore that Césaire in A Tempest has created a deterritorialized reality when it comes to the relationship of Africa and French, here African language and French, which simply means that one can no longer be without the other, because the process of deterritorialization is the process of dismantling purities. In other words, you're no longer what you ontologically were, with your contact with something else. So that is a point that I agree is Césaire's graduated insight in A Tempest, which moves from 1939 in notebook that we characterize as his classic on negritude, all the way to 1969, 30 years process. So, but I want us to maintain what he does in A Tempest. So there's of course some declarations I want to make, which dovetails from what I'm saying regarding A Tempest. And there's so many things I could say in terms of that, and I present them simply as general conclusions based on my reading of the play and based on my reading of other Césaire's texts on colonialism, for example, Discourse on Colonialism. So it is safe to say, therefore, for Césaire, decolonization of Africa requires African ontology, hence African worldview, especially if we can think of a shoe. In addition to that, it is safe to say also that African ontology by itself cannot bring about sense of humanism founded on decolonization. So at this point, I want to refer back again to Professor Lawrence's remarks about the Afrocentricity of peace in Africa. So I don't think that would be the best way, because that will, of course, be cutting Africa out of what, quote unquote, we call modernity, which modernity, you have to actually say whose modernity, but let me just use that term presently to say that focusing mainly on African sensibility as the vehicle for this peace is disconnecting Africa from the rest of the world and preventing Africa to tap the avalanche of profundity in the rest of the world. So it is also important to note, especially with regard to Césaire's position on French, that it is proper to borrow from other cultures in your process of creating a solution to a problem, because his French is not pure. It is a French that is mixed with Creole, mixed with African sensibility, and also mixed with his desire to destroy or dismantle what he called colonialism. Now I'm going to move on to Fanon. And I want to pay attention mainly to what so many people have identified as his seminal works. But I'm only pulling on two essays in these works. One, The Negro and Language, and on national culture. The Negro and Language is rather a direct essay on the impact of the Negro encounter with the colonizer's language and what the Negro has done in order to demonstrate his expertise in this colonial language. So Fanon is French, of course. So in the process of learning French, you are learning the language of the colonizer. And he tells the story of how he spends really time to master this language, but later realizes that in mastering this language, he's actually becoming the colonizer. So the foundation of his anti-colonial discourse is really his realization that the possession of this colonizer's language does not really give him access to his own being. It does not give him access to understand the ramifications of his experience. So we can say, if I may use Heidegger's definition of language as house of being, he's using he's using French language the way the French spoke it, took him out of his own house of being and put him into a different house. So his realization of that is the foundation of his anti-colonial discourse. Now, Fanon did not preach that we go and start learning different languages, but on national culture, he developed or presents what I call 3 ecstasies with regard to national culture. And these 3 ecstasies have been studied quite a bit. So what I'm trying to show you is how what he does on national culture reflects what I believe César does with a tempest. And that is the necessity of a shoe, the necessity of straddling with clarity these opposing realities. So these 3 ecstasies I'm talking about can easily be identified. One is what he calls white error, okay, which is what he presents in the Negro and language. So you want to be like a white person, you speak the language of the white person. And I can spend time here telling you stories from my own Nigeria, where people believe that they have become someone when they speak what they call Queen's English. And I was also a victim of that. In my university years, I was in a society where you are fined if you speak my language, which is Igbo. So you pay fine if you speak it. And I know a lot of people who will actually assume quite terrible error because they believe they're speaking Queen's English. So that's what he considers to be white error. But he's not really presenting that or prescribing that. And this white error is quite akin to what Homi Bhabha called ambivalence that results from colonial contact. So you want to be like a white man, but you can never be. So you're almost like, but not. So that will not really extend any processes of decolonization. And then the second ecstasy is what people present as neo-romantic Afrocentrism. That is focusing that going back to Africa and focusing on Africa will become a solution. In other words, will become really the foundation of decolonizing agenda. And as I said, that is not what César was doing or is still doing in that play, because that will disconnect Africa from the rest of the world. So his ultimate ecstasy, which he seemingly prescribes, is what he calls the processes of reciprocity. In other words, you don't deny what is good in the culture that you come in contact with, but you find a way to negotiate that and use that as a means for you to solve the problem. So I'm going to use George Steiner's concept of interanimation, which is a concept in translation to explain the concept of reciprocity. And he says it's just a dialectics of fusion in which identity survives, altered, but also strengthened and redefined by virtue of reciprocity. So there is some kind of unity, and that goes back to the concept of deterritorialization. Deterritorialization is not destructive, it's rather enabling, and it gives you an opportunity to see diverse realities because now you have similarly a compendium of perspectives. As you can see, that is really an extension of what Cesare was doing and still doing in A Tempest. There is a statement in Black Skin, White Max that supports my reading of Fanon. And that statement, I call it incomplete, complete thought. It goes like this: the Negro is not. And then the sentence ends. Of course, there's a period. And what comes after that any more than the white man? Now, those of us in language knows that the second half of that is not really a sentence. So you can see that Fanon intentionally presents that. So when you're reading it, the natural thing to do is to correct that sentence. Or you will say, well, there's an error here, but it's not a cognitive error. Fanon presents it like that, and reading this particular sentence, Homi Bhabha argues that Fanon ruptures the distinction between the black and the white, and invariably critiques any agenda that isolates one from the other. So if you look at that statement again and you fall into the temptation of correcting it, you will have something like the Negro is not anything more than the white man, which will force you automatically to reverse it. The white man is not anything more than the Negro. So what Homi Bhabha didn't do is to look at the sentence that comes immediately after that. And that sentence is what I quoted, and I read, it says, both, which means the Negro and the white man, must turn their backs on the inhuman voices which were those of their respective ancestors in order that authentic communication be possible. And I believe that's a direct statement. So going back to the Romans of Afrocentrism, or going back to Eurocentric ideology of domination will not really do anybody any good, in which case you will still have that rupture in that incomplete, complete thought. At this time, I want to move on to Thiong'o. And anyone who has read anything about decolonization, of course, knows about Thiong'o. His seminal work on decolonization, I would say, is not just decolonizing the mind, which was published in 1986, but every statement he makes is essentially a decolonizing statement. Now, he started doing this in 1962 when there was African Writers Conference. And the name of that conference, as some of you of course know, is African Writers of English Expression. Now, you could see how colonial that particular statement is. African Writers of English Expression. Now, so many writers were brought to this conference, but Ngugi was wondering why African writers who were writing in African languages were not invited. And of course, he's been doing his work in that area all through, with writers in politics, decolonizing the mind, moving the center, and Wizard of the Crow, which was published 20 years after he decided not to write in English again. And I'm going to tell a story here. 20 years after he decided not to write in English again. So he was writing, of course, in Ngugi. So Wizard of the Crow was originally published in 3 installments in Ngugi. It wasn't published in English. And these 3 installments totaled 892 pages. When it came out in 2006 in English, it came out to 776. Now, my position is that Ngugi intentionally chose to write that novel in Ngugi to prove that African languages can produce a novel of that magnitude, in which case he's challenging the Victorian authors who are writing tomes that are over 700 pages. So making that particular statement proves, therefore, that these languages are viable and that they are portal to a consciousness that is different from the colonial language. However, if you become quite critical of Wizard of the Crow, you will see that the story or the plot of Wizard of the Crow in itself is decolonizing. What do I mean? It is simply a story about a nameless named place. When I say nameless named place, there's no place called Republic of Aburira. So that's the location. And there is this ruler of Aburira who is a dictator, and all the people around him are around him because they want to gain something from him. And based on the characterization, they have one deformity or the other. So you will see right away that Ngugi is trying to be quite critical of African politics and African politicians as agents of colonialism, or if you like, agents of neocolonialism, which is nothing but extension of colonialism. Now, what happens in the story shows that Ngugi is very critical of Africans who subscribe to the principles of colonialism, be it through leadership or through language or even through ordinary politics. Because the character that actually saves the ruler is an ordinary character who has access to the culture of the people. Now, why am I bringing Wizard of the Crow into the metrics of this conversation? It is important to know that the Ngugi version of the story contains other languages, which if you're not familiar with, you will not understand. It is a patois, it's called Sheng. It's a patois spoken in East Africa. And if you look closely, analytically on the linguistics of Ngugi, you will see that Ngugi conceived the story in English and then put it down in Ngugi as a political statement to show that this language are viable and that they can really produce a novel. Because some of the Ngugi statements are nothing but transliteration of English sentence, in which case that if you are Ngugi, if you speak Ngugi and you don't have access to English language, you may not even understand that Ngugi sentence. So we have there again a matrix or a unity of consciousness, even though it's rendered in one language. So what I see in César with regard to fusion, and what I see in Fanon with regard to fission is also present in Ngugi, especially in that novel, Wizard of the Crow. Now, in an interview, Ngugi said himself that he's not preaching isolation. He's not saying that you should not learn another language, but rather we have to learn the indigenous language, and then beyond that, we can learn any other language. That it is only through that that we get empowerment. So decolonization is not from Ngugi, a process of isolating Africa and keeping Africa in its beauties of indigenous languages. He's not saying that. He's saying, therefore, that in as much as colonial language would take the African from the African consciousness, we have to go back to that base, rebuild this language, but still go beyond that to empower ourselves so that we can navigate the realities of all the cultures that we come in contact with. And that really goes back to his understanding of what language is. Language builds collective memory. But you don't want to keep your own memory to yourself. You have to be able to come out of that to encounter other memories, which means other languages. In the process of doing that, he cautions us really quite clearly that in engaging in our understanding of other languages, we must not commit what he calls linguicide, nor should we commit what he calls linguifam. And those are neologisms, but as you can see from what appears to be merging of Latin and English in the first word, is really destruction of a language, or what he calls liquidation of a language. That is focusing on what Fanon calls white error. So you want to be like a white person speaking the white man's language. That will become, of course, linguicide. But if you move away from that, when you stop using your own language in schools, in policies, in reconstructions of reality, then you are really undergoing a famine. In other words, the language will slowly die away. So you have to be able to use that language. And that is exactly what Wizard of the Crow does, irrespective of the narrative structure, which is rather complex, irrespective of Ngugi's uses of oral culture in the story. He's actually saying we must not starve these languages, nor should we engage in linguicide. And what he does with that story and with all his decolonizing agenda with regard to language is akin to the enactment of Asamara's declaration, which I'm going to share and point to the 10th agenda. There'll be silence, and that simply means I'm trying to share this link. The 10th point in the declaration simply says African languages are essential for the decolonization of African minds and for the African Renaissance. So, and that simply goes to say that any decolonizing project or agenda requires access to these languages, because it is through that they will really get to the people that they want to get to. So we can, from now, try to formulate some understanding based on what I've just said about these three writers. One is Eradication of Dependency. So the African mind should not depend on the Western mind to understand his worldview. Indigenous languages should be recognized and used. And how do we go about doing this? Well, there are processes that we can follow. One of them is translation. And the translation, of course, is a process of sharing tradition without treachery. You don't want to translate to destroy or translate to tell a different story. So the processes could, of course, be depending on the flow of the message. If you're moving African text into the Western text, there is a necessity of using the process of foreignization, which is a concept in translation, so that when that language gets into the new language, it retains still the concept it has in its original structure without doing what is called domestication, so that if you translate an African text into English, for example, then you are really destroying it, making it domestic to those who are reading it for them to understand. So you have to avoid treachery and use what I describe as eloquent hospitality, which is simply a way of recognizing what should be done, a way of recognizing what should be translated and making that available in the target language. Now, I want to be fair by saying that there are existing adventures in this kind of hospitality or in this kind of translation or in the access to African languages, which is really done well by BBC News. They have now news in Hausa, they have news in Igbo, they have in other African languages. So I'm gonna share this link just for 1 second, then I'll wrap up. So these are all the languages. If you look on this side, you will see all the African languages. So this is possible. We can really engage in decolonizing processes by tapping into African languages and maintaining what I've said across these three writers, that romanticization of Africa is not going to be the solution, but rather trying to understand how we can create a fusion, but recognizing the integrity of Africa in the process of that fusion. So at this time, I want to make my final remarks. So we should therefore see colonial decolonization as a process of privileging Africa so that Africa will be Africa for itself as opposed to Africa in itself. And of course, those in existentialism will understand the distinction. Africa in itself is simply Africa as an object, as a thingified reality. But Africa for itself means that Africa participates in the creation of its purpose in the world. Thank you.
Proper language, we need proper vocabulary. You keep your questions or suggestions short and you go straight to the point, and then I will take one by one. I think it will work that way. And I'm not sure how much time we have, but we will go along and see how it goes. Thank you very much, bro.